Professor Finkelstein is a professor of political science at DePaul University in Chicago. He gained his PhD from Princeton University in 1988 from the Department of Politics there. His thesis was on the theory of Zionism. Since that point, he has published 5 books on topics including the Holocaust, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and historical memory and the politics of history. Most recently, he published Beyond Chutzpah on the misuse of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history. This book especially elicited controversy, including an ongoing public debate with Professor Alan Dershowitz, as well as a lot of op-ed pieces, TV appearances, speaking engagements such as this one. Today's topic, in fact, is a little different from what was initially advertised. Professor Finkelstein will be talking about the current crisis in Gaza and in Lebanon. So please join me in welcoming Professor Finkelstein to Parkside.
The 2 areas I would like to look at this afternoon are what's happening as we speak right now in Gaza and what happened during the summer months in Lebanon. For those of you who aren't familiar with the topic, let me just fill in a little background. There are 2 areas of what was called Palestine, which Israel conquered in the June 1967 war. One area is called the West Bank, the other area is called Gaza. And those are the 2 areas that have been the main ones under contention about who's going to control them, Israel or the Palestinians. Roughly about a year and a half ago, there was what was called a withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, a topic to which I'll return in a few moments. In any case, the events about which I'm going to be speaking about this afternoon, I'll begin with Gaza and then turn to Lebanon. The events in Gaza, the current round begins in January 2006 when the Islamic movement in Palestine called Hamas is elected into office. And they actually take power in March 2006. Immediately as the Hamas leadership is elected into power in what everybody agreed was a democratic election, the United States, Israel, and regrettably the European Union as well, imposed a brutal economic blockade on Hamas, imposed brutal economic sanctions on Hamas, and they said that they would only lift the sanctions if the new government would agree to 2 terms. And the 2 terms were, number 1, the new government had to renounce the use of violence against Israel or renounce the use of terrorism against Israel. And number 2, the new government had to recognize the state of Israel. Those were the basic 2 conditions which were put on Hamas by the United States, Israel, and the European Union. Now, as everybody knows, if you apply a single principle across the board, you can, I think, there are exceptions, but you can, with a reasonable amount of honesty, call it a moral principle. Moral principles become moral principles because they're uniformly applied across the board. But if you take a principle and you apply it to only one side, it ceases to be a moral principle and it becomes a hypocritical principle. So now we have to look at those 2 principles which were imposed on Hamas, the renunciation of violence and the recognition of Israel. And we have to look and see whether these are moral principles, in which case they merit support, or whether they are hypocritical principles, in which case they merit denunciation. Well, let's look at those principles then. The first one, that Hamas has to renounce violence. Presumably that means renouncing terrorism. terrorism being the standard definition, the targeting of civilians to achieve political ends. That's the pretty conventional definition of terrorism. Okay, in my view, that's a reasonable principle. At any rate, it's what international law requires. The most basic principle of international law when it comes to war, or what's called the laws of war, the most basic principle is what's called the principle of distinction. That is, you have to distinguish between combatants and civilians. Terrorism, because it targets civilians, is illegal under international law. So the principle sounds pretty fair, or I should say a reasonable principle, it being, at any rate, what international law requires. So now let's look at the record. If you look at the numbers from September 28th, 2000 until today, I choose that date because that's the beginning of what's been called the Second Intifada, the second revolt of the Palestinian population against Israeli rule. Since September 28th, 2000, approximately 1,000 Israelis have been killed and about 3,900 Palestinians have been killed, a ratio of close to 4-to-1. 4 times as many Palestinians as Israelis have been killed. On both sides, between 1/2 and 2/3 have been civilians. So if you look at the numbers as raw figures, about 4 times as many Palestinian civilians have been killed as Israeli civilians who have been killed. At that level, it would seem that the label of terrorist applies with much greater force to Israel than it does to the Palestinians. Now, some people dispute that claim by saying there is a difference between Palestinians who deliberately target Israeli civilians and Israel, which in the course of carrying out legitimate military attacks, accidentally kills Palestinians. The problem with that argument is it's simply not supported by what human rights organizations have written. I don't have time now to go into it, but there's a huge record, a huge amount of documentation by mainstream human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and many Israeli human rights organizations, which look precisely at this question of who is Israel killing. And the conclusions they reach, without going through each and every report with you this afternoon, is number one, Israel does frequently deliberately target civilians. Number two, Israel uses indiscriminate firepower at Palestinians. And under international law, if you indiscriminately shoot at a population, it's no different than if you deliberately target them. What does that mean? If there is a huge crowd of demonstrators, and there may be one person among those demonstrators who has live ammunition, if you indiscriminately fire at that crowd of civilians in order to kill one person or disable one person who has live ammunition, human rights organizations say that's no different than deliberately killing civilians. To quote Israel's leading authority on the topic, a fellow named Yoram Dinstein, a very smart fellow, president of the Tel Aviv University and a major authority in international law, he says, there is no genuine difference between a premeditated attack against civilians and a reckless disregard of the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants. they are equally forbidden. So, on the first rationale for the EU, the European Union, American, Israeli sanctions against the Palestinians, it would appear that the record of Israel is not only not better, but it's many times worse. The only difference being no sanctions have been imposed on Israel. Let's turn to that second principle, that Hamas, the new Islamic government, has to recognize the state of Israel. Well, that seems pretty reasonable also. Israel is a member state of the United Nations, and like every member state of the UN, it's entitled to have its borders respected and to live at peace with its neighbors. A fundamental principle of the United Nations anchored in what's called Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, the respect for the territorial integrity and political sovereignty of every member state. That seems to me uncontroversial. Israel is a state like any other, and it has the right to have its borders, its sovereignty, its territorial integrity respected. And it's true that Hamas's, the current Palestinian government, its position has been ambiguous, unclear where it exactly stands. Some statements by Hamas indicate that it's willing to have what it calls the Arab term, which Professor Dana knows better than me. I always hate to use foreign terms because my linguistic talents are very limited. I am an American, which means English is my second language, grunts being the first language. But what they call a hudna, which basically means a long-term truce or an armistice with Israel. That's been Hamas's position. Sometimes it seems like they're willing to go a little bit further. Sometimes it seems like they're not willing to go that far. But you can say, I think, with a reasonable amount of accuracy, that their position has been somewhat ambiguous on the question of recognizing Israel. My own view, for whatever it's worth, is that if they ever reach the negotiating table, they will agree to the international consensus for resolving the conflict, to which I'll get to in a moment. But now we have to see, is this principle that's being imposed on Hamas, is it being imposed on them only, or is it being imposed across the board? If it's only on them, it's hypocritical. If it's across the board, it's a moral principle. So what does the record show? The record shows that no Israeli government, no Israeli political party, no Israeli senior official has ever recognized the right of Palestinians to a state within the areas which under international law have been designated for what's called Palestinian self-determination. That is to say, I began my remarks, you may recall, by pointing out that there were two areas that have been contested between Israel and the Palestinians. Those areas being the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Now, under international law, I don't have time to go through it now, under international law, the whole of the Gaza and the whole of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, are occupied Palestinian territory. That is not my personal opinion. Frankly, you should not care at all about my personal opinion. None of you know who I am, and my personal opinion carries exactly zero weight in the court of public opinion. When I say that none of those territories belong to Israel, and the whole of those territories belong to the Palestinians. I'm quoting to you the opinion not of Norman Finkelstein, but of the International Court of Justice. In July 2004, the World Court, in the course of an important ruling on the wall that Israel is building in the occupied territories, in the course of that ruling, it stated that the whole of Gaza, the whole of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, are, and now I'm quoting them, occupied Palestinian territory. Those areas, the World Court said, have been designated for Palestinian self-determination. Now, as I said a moment ago, not a single Israeli government, not a single Israeli political party, not a single Israeli official has ever recognized the rights of Palestinians to self-determination within those areas. I will give you an example from a very long potential list of examples. Take December 2005. Every year, the United Nations General Assembly votes on how to resolve this conflict, a conflict which is now older than most of the people in this room times 2. The conflict begins in June 1967, the current round of the conflict, which means it's nearly 40 years old now. It'll be 40 years old this year. Most of the young people in the room are probably around 18 or 19, which means it's now twice your age. In some cases, it's the age of your parents. And that's how long the Palestinians have been living under occupation, from the day not that you were born, but from the day your parents were born. Till now, they have been living under an occupation which has denied them any rights under international law. Well, every year the United Nations votes on how to resolve this conflict. It comes up every December. It's called Peaceful Settlement of the Palestine Question. And every year, the same resolution is put forth. It calls for 2 states in the area that used to be called Palestine, the Israeli state within its June 1967 borders, and that Palestinian state within the West Bank and Gaza with East Jerusalem as its capital. And every year, the vote is always the same. The vote is the whole world on one side, and then there are 7 countries on the other side. It's always, you can check it on the web, as they say. On the other side, against the 2-state settlement, it's always the United States, Israel, Palau, P-A-L-A-U, Nauru, N-A-U-R-U, Tuvalu, T-U-V-A-L-U, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. That's it. The whole world saying a 2-state settlement, the United States, Israel, and those 5 other places saying no. Now, some of you are no doubt wondering, what is Nauru, Palau, Tuvalu? Well, without going into the details, they are South Sea Island atolls, places which you would surely like to visit in the cold winter months, the total population of which could comfortably fit in the empty seats in this room with room left over. So that's been the record, but once again, no sanctions have been put on Israel for its refusal to recognize a Palestinian state within the borders designated under international law. We also have a second difference which is worth paying attention to. That is, so far I have been comparing words versus words, the words of the Hamas government and the words of Israel. But Israel doesn't only, Israel's record is not only embodied in words, it's also embodied in actions. That is to say, as we speak now, Israel is rapidly dismembering, taking apart the West Bank, making it impossible for a Palestinian state ever to come into being. They are building a wall in the West Bank, which is annexing about 10% of Palestinian territory to Israel. They have also de facto annexed what's called the Jordan Valley, which means another 25% of the West Bank has been annexed to Israel. They are also building settlements in the north in an area called Ariel, in the center in an area called Ma'ale Adanim, which is cutting up the West Bank into little pieces, chopping it up. And basically what the Palestinians are being offered is what The Economist, the British publication The Economist, called a Swiss cheese state over about 40 or 50% of the West Bank, as well as Gaza. Okay, that's the basic picture as it's been looking since January, but things have taken a decided turn for the worse in the last several months. Things began to go precipitously downhill at the end of June when Palestinians captured one Israeli soldier, a single Israeli soldier, and asked in return that Israel release several hundred Palestinian children and women who it was holding. Israel currently holds about 9,000 Palestinians prisoner, a large number in the several hundreds being children and women. And the Palestinian government asked for a prisoner swap. The one soldier we hold for several hundred of those that you're holding, and not even asking for the release of the male prisoners, numbering in the several thousands. The Palestinians, I should say Israel, refused the prisoner swap, and it proceeded now to starve Gaza into submission, cutting off all of its ties with the outside world and preventing any kind of traffic in and out of Gaza. Since Hamas took power, I'll return to that in a moment. I want to just look briefly, quickly at the numbers. Since Hamas took power at the end of March till today, 500 Palestinians have been killed by Israelis, while 19 Israelis have been killed by Palestinians, a ratio of about 26-1. Since that incident when the one Israeli soldier was captured, it's been a ratio of 76 Palestinians killed per Israeli, or 400 Palestinians killed to just 5 Israelis, 400 to 5. In the case of Gaza, the figures, it's very hard to calculate because the numbers are now rapidly growing. There was 50 Palestinians killed over the weekend, 20 Palestinians killed last night. The figures are, as of now, approximately, since that one day the one soldier was captured, because we know every Israeli life is important. So since that one Israeli soldier was captured, about 350 Palestinians have been killed. 2 Israelis have been killed, 1 by friendly fire in Gaza. The second was just killed this past week. 350 to 2. You hear all these terrible stories in the news about those Qassam missiles that the Gazans have been firing into Israel. And that's another one of their pretexts, their excuses for this slaughter that's now going on in Gaza. But what the news reports never tell you is that these terrible, lethal Qassam missiles, they've killed exactly 5 Israelis in the last 6 years, which means almost certainly in Wisconsin, more Wisconsinites have been killed by Roman candles on July 4th in the past 6 years than Israelis have been killed by Qassam missiles in the last 5 years. In addition to the slaughter and the starvation going on in Gaza, Israel took hostage about 1/3 of the elected government of the Palestinians, 1/3 of the Hamas legislators. When I use the expression hostage, again, it's not mine. The expression belongs to Meron Ben-Venisti, one of the leading Israeli commentators on the Israel-Palestine conflict. We hear a lot about that one soldier which the Palestinians allegedly took hostage, though I personally don't believe you can take a soldier hostage. You can capture a soldier. But we hear nothing about those 1/3 of the whole Palestinian legislature was taken hostage, at least that's what Meron Ben-Venisti says, by the Israelis. What does Gaza look like now as we meet today, this afternoon? Let me quote a few people. Quotes are usually boring, and people start to drift in their thoughts. But actually, these quotes, I think, will capture your attention. Let's begin with Patrick Coburn, a veteran foreign correspondent for the British newspaper, The Independent. He says, "Gaza is dying. The Israeli siege of the Palestinian enclave is so tight that its people are on the edge of starvation. A whole society is being destroyed. There are 1.5 million Palestinians imprisoned in the most heavily populated area in the world. The sound that Palestinians most dread is an unknown voice on their cell phone saying, 'You have a half hour to leave.'